Harlem, 1964, late February night outside the Audubon Ballroom. Malcolm X steps through the side door, collar up against the cold. He's just finished a 3-hour meeting. Plans, strategies, the machinery of building something new after the split. A man waits by the door. Torn coat, shoes held together with electrical tape, hands shaking from more than cold. He asks for food, not money. Food for his family. Malcolm stops. The crowd behind him stops. Everyone watching. Malcolm reaches into his jacket pocket, pulls out a folded $20 bill, creased down the middle. Hands it over, leans in close. Says something nobody else can hear. The man's hand shakes taking it. Malcolm walks away, disappears into the Harlem night. 2 days later, that same man shows up at Malcolm's house. What he carried in his pocket, what Malcolm set in motion with that single bill, changed 3 families forever. This is the story nobody filmed, nobody reported, nobody knew. Until now. The man's name was James Wheeler. 52 years old, worked construction until his back gave out in 1962. By February 1964, he was living in a basement apartment on 147th Street with his wife Dorothy and their 3 children, ages 7, 9, and 11. Dorothy was sick. Pneumonia that wouldn't quit, spreading through her lungs like ice. No money for doctors. No heat in the apartment. 1 light bulb in the main room. The children slept on 2 mattresses pushed together on the concrete floor. James had heard Malcolm speak once, months before, at a street rally. Something about the way Malcolm looked at people, really looked, made James think maybe, just maybe, this man might listen. So he waited outside the Audubon that night. Waited 3 hours in the cold. When Malcolm came out, James asked for food. Not money. Food. He had 3 children, he said. His wife was sick. Malcolm didn't hesitate. Pulled out the 20, handed it over. Then he did something James didn't expect. He asked for the address. James wrote it on a scrap of paper, hands shaking so hard Malcolm had to steady them. Malcolm folded the paper, put it in his pocket next to where the 20 had been. Said he'd be by. James didn't believe him. Everyone says they'll be by. 2 days later, a knock on the basement door. Dorothy was in bed. Fever at 103. The children were at school. James opened the door and there stood Malcolm X. No cameras, no security, no entourage. Just Malcolm, in a dark coat, hands in his pockets. He looked at James. "Can I come in?" James stepped aside. Malcolm walked through the apartment slowly. Looked at everything. The mattresses. The single light bulb. The makeshift stove James had built from a hot plate and some bricks. Dorothy in bed, shivering under 2 thin blankets. Malcolm sat down in the 1 chair they had. Didn't say anything for a full minute. Then he asked questions. How long had they been here? How long had Dorothy been sick? What did the children eat? James answered everything. Malcolm listened without interrupting, without judging. 90 minutes passed. Malcolm stood up, shook James's hand, told Dorothy he'd pray for her. Then he left. James thought that was it. The visit. The listening. That was the gesture. He didn't know Malcolm had already started making phone calls from the car. That night, Malcolm contacted 3 people. First, Dr. Samuel Harris, an old friend from his Nation of Islam days who'd left the organization around the same time Malcolm had. Malcolm asked him to visit the Wheeler family, examine Dorothy, bring whatever medicine she needed. Paid him $200 cash. Second, a landlord Malcolm knew who owned buildings in a better part of Harlem. Malcolm asked about vacant apartments. 2-bedroom, heat included. The landlord owed Malcolm a favor from years back. Said he had something on the 5th floor. Malcolm said he'd take it, paid first month's rent. Third, a grocer on Lenox Avenue, Malcolm arranged a tab, $50 a week, food only. He'd pay it himself every Friday. Cash. The grocer agreed. No questions. Malcolm hung up the phone and sat in his car outside the Wheeler apartment for 20 minutes. He didn't go back inside. Didn't tell James what was coming. Just sat there, thinking. Then he drove home. His wife, Betty, was awake. Reading. He kissed her forehead, didn't mention where he'd been. Not yet. Some things you had to see through first. Dr. Harris showed up at the Wheeler apartment the next morning. Brought a medical bag, antibiotics, exam equipment. He examined Dorothy for 30 minutes. Pneumonia and malnutrition, he said. Treatable, but it would take time. He left medication, instructions, his phone number. Told James he'd be back in 3 days. No mention of payment, no bills. James asked how much he owed. Harris smiled. "It's handled," he said. He returned 3 times that week. By the 4th visit, Dorothy's fever had broken. By the 2nd week, she was sitting up, eating solid food. By the 3rd week, she was walking around the apartment. Harris never sent a bill. Never mentioned Malcolm's name. Years later, when asked about it, he'd only say, "Some debts you pay forward." Malcolm had told him one thing: tell no one. Harris kept that promise. Even when Dorothy asked who sent him, Harris just said a friend. She never found out until much later. But she knew. Somehow she knew. The landlord called Malcolm a week after Dr. Harris's first visit. The apartment was ready. 5th floor, 2 bedrooms, heat, hot water, everything working. Malcolm drove to 147th Street that afternoon. Knocked on the basement door. James answered, looking better. Dorothy was recovering. The medication was working. Malcolm told him about the apartment. Gave him the address. Said the first 2 months were paid. After that, James would need to cover it. Rent was $60 a month. James started to cry. Malcolm put a hand on his shoulder. "You'll manage," he said. "Get your wife healthy. Get the kids settled. The rest will follow." 4 days later, James borrowed a friend's truck. Malcolm showed up, helped carry boxes, wore old clothes, no bow tie, no suit. The neighbors didn't recognize him. They saw a tall man helping a family move, nothing more. Malcolm left before the family finished unpacking, drove home and told Betty everything. She asked why he hadn't told her sooner. He said, "Because I needed to make sure it would work first." Malcolm asked James a question during one of his visits. "You know anyone else?" James mentioned a woman who'd lived upstairs from the old basement place. Single mother, 4 children, husband killed in a factory accident 6 months prior. No income, no family nearby, living on welfare that barely covered food. Malcolm visited her that night. Her name was Clara. She was 34, looked 50. 4 children under 10 years old. Malcolm sat in her kitchen, listened to her story, asked the same questions he'd asked James. How long? What they needed. What she was doing to survive. Clara answered everything, not understanding why this man cared. Malcolm stood up, thanked her for her time, said someone would be in touch. 3 days later, Dr. Harris showed up. Then the landlord called with an apartment. Then the grocer added her name to the tab. Clara didn't know what was happening. Thought maybe it was a church program, some kind of charity. Malcolm never told her his name. Just set the machinery in motion and stepped back. Then there was a 3rd family. James knew them, a couple with 4 children, the father a Korean War veteran who couldn't find steady work, the mother doing laundry for pennies. Malcolm visited them next. Same process. Listened. Asked questions. Made phone calls. Within 2 weeks, all 3 families had new apartments, medical care, food. Malcolm was paying for all of it out of his speaking fees. He was making decent money in early 1964, lectures, appearances, interviews. Most of it went to his own family, but he carved out money for the three families. Roughly $150 a week total. Every Friday, he'd drive to the grocer on Lenox Avenue, hand over cash, check the handwritten ledger the grocer kept. 3 names, 3 tabs. Malcolm would run his finger down the columns, make sure the numbers made sense. Never question the amounts. Just paid and left. The grocer asked once why he was doing this. Malcolm said, "Because nobody else will." That was the only explanation he ever gave. Malcolm started handling the details. Got the Wheeler children enrolled at PS 139. Contacted the principal directly, used his name. The principal, a black woman named Mrs. Johnson, knew exactly who Malcolm was. She asked no questions, just got the paperwork done. Winter coats appeared at the Wheeler apartment. Malcolm had contacted someone at a church he'd spoken at once. School supplies showed up in boxes. The children didn't know where any of it came from, just that things were getting better. Their mother was healthy. They had heat. They had food. They had coats and notebooks and pencils. Malcolm attended one school play that winter, sat in the very back row, left before the lights came up. A teacher recognized him, mentioned it to Mrs. Johnson. Mrs. Johnson said nothing. Some secrets were worth keeping. Malcolm never asked for recognition, never wanted his name attached. He'd learned something in all his years of public life. The most important work happens when nobody's watching. But someone was watching. The FBI had been tailing Malcolm since he split from the Nation of Islam. They assumed he was dangerous, radical, planning something. They watched his house, tapped his phone, followed him around Harlem. On February 18, 1964, an agent noted in a surveillance log that Malcolm visited an unidentified residence on the Lower East Side. The agent noted he returned to the same address multiple times over the following weeks. They assumed it was a safe house, maybe weapons, maybe planning meetings. They never investigated further. If they had, they would have found Clara and her 4 children. They would have found Malcolm helping carry groceries upstairs. They would have found him sitting at her kitchen table, asking about her kids' schoolwork. But they didn't investigate. They just wrote it down and moved on. They missed what was actually happening. They missed the story, and Malcolm preferred it that way. Malcolm started helping the men find work. James Wheeler got a maintenance job at a building where Malcolm had given a speech once. The building manager owed Malcolm a favor. James started in March 1964, $60 a week. It was enough. Dorothy recovered fully and started cleaning houses, work she found through a woman at church, but Malcolm had made a call there too. The second family, Clara, got a job at a restaurant through one of Malcolm's contacts. The third family, the Korean War vet, got union construction work. Malcolm knew people in the union. Made one phone call. The vet started a week later. All 3 families working. Children in school, heat, food, medical care, Malcolm's network, invisible threads connecting people who didn't even know they were connected. Nobody made the connection back to him. The families were surviving, then thriving. Malcolm watched it all from a distance, never mentioned it in speeches, never brought it up in interviews. It wasn't about him. Betty Shabazz found the photographs in March 1964. She was looking for something in Malcolm's desk and found an envelope tucked in the back of a drawer. Inside were 3 photographs. The Wheeler children, smiling, school photos. The second family's youngest at a birthday party. The third family, all together, standing in front of their new apartment building. Betty stared at them. She didn't recognize any of the faces. She asked Malcolm that night who they were. He told her everything. The man outside the Audubon, the basement apartment, the phone calls, the 3 families, the money, all of it. Betty started crying. Not sad tears. Something else. She asked why he hadn't told her. Malcolm said, "Because it wasn't about me. It was about them." Betty held the photographs, looked at the faces, children who were eaten now, families who had heat. She understood then. Her husband was many things, controversial, outspoken, uncompromising. But this was who he was when nobody was looking. James Wheeler wrote a letter to Malcolm in April 1964. He never mailed it, kept it in his wallet, folded next to the $20 bill Malcolm had given him that first night. The letter thanked Malcolm for saving his family, described watching his children eat full meals for the first time in months, his wife healthy, laughing again, a home with heat and light. He wrote that he prayed for Malcolm every night, that his children prayed for Malcolm even though they didn't know his name. The letter ended, "You gave us more than money. You gave us back our lives. You showed us we mattered to someone. I will never forget that. My children will never forget that." Malcolm never read it. Wheeler kept it hidden, something private, something sacred. After Malcolm died, Wheeler would take it out sometimes, read it to himself. The words he never got to say, the gratitude he never got to express. It stayed folded in that $20 bill for 50 years. February 21st, 1965. Audubon Ballroom. Malcolm X gunned down in front of 400 people. The news spread like fire through Harlem. James Wheeler was at work when he heard. He left immediately, went home, turned on the television. Dorothy was already watching, tears streaming down her face. The children came home from school. They watched together. The news reports flooded in. International leader, controversial figure, Nation of Islam. Assassination. None of it mentioned 3 families in Harlem. None of it mentioned basement apartments or grocery tabs or quiet visits. None of it mentioned the man who helped 15 people when nobody was looking. James held the folded $20 bill in his hand, squeezed it until his knuckles went white. Dorothy collapsed on the couch. The children didn't understand. They knew something terrible had happened, but they didn't know it was the man who'd saved them. James never told them. Not that day. Not for years. Some things were too big to explain. Faith Temple, February 27th, 1965. Malcolm's funeral. Thousands of people crammed into the church and spilled out onto the sidewalk. Dignitaries, activists, reporters, cameras everywhere. In the very back, standing together, were 3 families. James Wheeler held his children close. Dorothy wore black, held a folded handkerchief. Clara stood with her 4 children, silent. The Korean War vet wore a borrowed suit, stood with his wife and kids. They didn't speak to reporters, didn't tell their story, just watched as Malcolm's coffin was carried out. They knew something the world didn't. They knew the man in that coffin had saved them. They knew he'd done it quietly, without cameras, without recognition. They knew the legend everyone was mourning was only half of who he was. As the coffin passed, James Wheeler touched the $20 bill in his pocket. Clara closed her eyes. The vet saluted. And the world kept talking about Malcolm X, the revolutionary, never knowing about Malcolm X, the quiet helper. The Wheeler children all graduated high school. The oldest became a teacher. The middle child became a nurse. The youngest became a postal worker. All 3 raised families, bought homes, lived full lives. James Wheeler worked until he was 70, kept the folded $20 bill in a frame on the wall of every home he lived in. Dorothy lived to 89, told the story to her grandchildren every year on Malcolm's birthday. Clara's children all found good work. One became a police officer, one a social worker, two went into business. The Korean War vet became a union foreman, retired at 65 with a pension. 15 people total, 3 families. Lives changed by a man who never wanted credit, never asked for recognition. The $20 bill, still folded, passed down through the Wheeler family. Malcolm's secret, kept for 50 years until the grandchildren started talking, until the stories started coming out. The folded $20 bill sits in a museum now, Harlem Historical Society, behind glass, creased down the middle, worn at the edges. A small card beside it reads, "Given by Malcolm X to James Wheeler, February 1964. Start of a quiet mission to help 3 families in Harlem. Thousands of people walk past it every year. Most don't stop. Those who do see a $20 bill and move on. But 3 families know different. They know it's the smallest part of the story. They know what Malcolm did when nobody was watching. They know the legend the world remembers, the fiery speeches, the confrontations, the revolutionary is only half of who he was. The other half lived in basement apartments and grocery tabs and quiet phone calls. The other half saved 15 lives. That's the Malcolm they knew. That's the Malcolm they'll never forget. And that $20 bill is all that's left to prove it was real.